I have spent 25 years as an Army logistics officer. My entire career was built on spotting hidden landmines, anticipating disasters, and surviving ambushes. But the most devastating trap of my life wasn't set in a war zone. It was set in my own hometown, orchestrated with chilling precision by the man I was supposed to marry in exactly 4 hours. If you have ever looked at the person you love and felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down your spine, do not ignore it. Because hiding inside a dusty military tailor shop, just minutes before walking down the aisle, I overheard a conversation that completely shattered my perfect life and ultimately saved it. This is a story about the devastating reality of financial betrayal. But more importantly, it is a masterclass in how to weaponize your intuition, reclaim your absolute independence, and dismantle the people who try to use your love against you. If you believe in women protecting their peace, standing in their power, and walking away from toxic illusions, please take a moment to hit the like button, share your own thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us build a community of strong Guang women and ensures these empowering stories reach the people who need to hear them most. Lo Mein story plays here. I spent 25 years of my life as an Army logistics officer, trained to foresee disasters long before they materialized on the horizon. My entire career was built on the foundation of anticipating the worst. I could map out complex supply chains across hostile territories, identifying every hidden landmine, every compromised bridge, and every potential ambush waiting in the dark. But the most dangerous and devastating ambush of my life did not happen in a war zone across the globe. It happened in my own quiet hometown, orchestrated with chilling precision by the man I was supposed to marry in less than 4 hours. If you have ever looked at the person sleeping next to you, the person who promised you a safe harbor, and felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down your spine, I need you to listen to me. Do not ignore that feeling. Do not silence your intuition just to keep the peace. His name was Richard Caldwell, and he was nothing like the men I had dated in the past. At 52, Richard was a highly respected estate planning attorney, a man whose reputation was built on stability, intellect, and an unshakable calm. After my grueling divorce a decade earlier, I had wrapped my heart in Kevlar. I was deeply independent, managing a demanding military career and a quiet personal life. But Richard had a way of bypassing my defenses. He did not try to overpower my independence. Instead, he applauded it. He understood the unique, isolating pressures of military life, offering a quiet, refined presence that felt like the ultimate sanctuary. When my parents passed away and left me our family's sprawling estate in Virginia, it was Richard who gently took the reins of the overwhelming legal paperwork. He suggested we create a prenuptial asset protection trust, a sophisticated legal maneuver he claimed would permanently shield my family's legacy from any potential military liabilities or future civilian lawsuits. It sounded incredibly smart. It sounded protective. I was so profoundly exhausted from having to be the strong one, the vigilant one, for 25 years, that I finally closed my eyes and let someone else take the wheel. I trusted him implicitly. It was a Tuesday morning, the air crisp with the promise of a beautiful wedding. I was standing in Dawson's Military Tailoring, a dusty, time-worn little shop tucked away right off the base. The air inside smelled of cedar wood, old brass polish, and heavy wool. William Vance, the 72-year-old retired Army sergeant who owned the shop, was kneeling on the scuffed linoleum floor, carefully adjusting the hem of my dress blues. We were chatting idly about the weather when the brass bell above the front door chimed with a sharp, unexpected ring. William glanced out the large front window, and in an instant, the color completely drained from his weathered face. Before I could even ask what was wrong, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength and shoved me backward into the cramped fitting room. He pulled the heavy velvet curtain shut, pressed a calloused finger to his lips, leaned in close, and whispered with a fierce urgency, "Colonel, I do not care what you hear out there. Do not come out. My heart began to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stood frozen in the dim light of the fitting room, my uniform heavy on my shoulders, as the front door swung open. Richard's unmistakable, booming voice filled the small shop. He wasn't alone. He had brought his junior law partner with him. They were laughing, their voices bouncing off the brick walls. I expected to hear Richard talking about the wedding, maybe picking up a last-minute accessory. Instead, the conversation I overheard was chillingly professional, stripped of any warmth or humanity. I heard the junior partner's nervous voice ask if the Cayman entity had cleared the final vetting process. Richard's response was smooth, arrogant, and entirely devoid of love. He explained that the moment the county clerk filed our marriage certificate the following morning at 9 o'clock, the irrevocable clause would automatically trigger. The entirety of the Virginia estate's liquid assets would seamlessly transfer to a newly formed offshore LLC. The junior partner hesitated, warning Richard that if I ever bothered to read the Schedule C addendum buried deep on page 42 of the trust, I would immediately realize I had signed away my own power of attorney. Richard just laughed a cold, metallic sound that I had never heard before. He told his partner not to worry, boasting that Maggie reads deployment manifests, not civilian trusts. He bragged that he had put up with my rigid military routines for 2 long years, and as far as he was concerned, he had earned his commission. Standing in the dark, with my hand pressed over my mouth to stifle a gasp, I felt the ground completely vanish beneath my feet as the illusion of my perfect life shattered into a million jagged pieces. The heavy brass bell chimed again, signaling their departure, and a suffocating silence fell over the tailoring shop. For a long moment, I could not bring myself to move. My breath was trapped in my throat, my vision blurring as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal washed over me. The curtain was slowly pulled back, revealing William standing there, his posture rigid and his eyes filled with a deep, silent sorrow. He did not offer me empty platitudes. He did not tell me that everything was going to be all right, or that perhaps I had misunderstood the incredibly damning conversation we had both just witnessed. As a fellow soldier, he knew better than to insult my intelligence with false hope. He simply offered me his hand, helping me step out of the fitting room as if I were a casualty being pulled from wreckage. I mechanically unbuttoned my dress uniform, the fabric suddenly feeling like a costume, and changed back into my civilian clothes. I thanked William, my voice sounding hollow and distant, like it belonged to a stranger. I walked out the back door of the shop and climbed into the driver's seat of my car, locking the doors behind me. It was there, in the stifling heat of the small parking lot, that the military discipline finally cracked, making way for the raw, agonizing reality of my human heart. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white and let out a sob that tore through my chest. I wept not just for the loss of a man I loved, but for the profound humiliation of having my intellect and my independence used as weapons against me. I wept for the future I had spent 2 years carefully constructing in my mind, a future of shared Sunday mornings, quiet retirement, and absolute safety. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on my lungs. Richard had not just tried to steal my money, he had tried to steal my dignity. He had looked at a 48-year-old woman and seen nothing but a gullible target, assuming that my desire for companionship would blind me to his financial siege. For 20 long minutes, I let the devastation completely consume me. I let myself feel every ounce of the pain, the embarrassment, and the sheer terror of how close I had come to signing away my life's legacy. But as the tears began to slow, a familiar, cold clarity began to settle over my mind. The logistics officer inside me, the woman who had spent decades navigating crises and dismantling threats, slowly woke up. I wiped my face, took a deep, shuddering breath, and reached for my phone. I dialed the only person in the world who could anchor me in the storm. My younger sister, Eleanor, a fierce, no-nonsense high school principal. Eleanor knew me better than I knew myself. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with wedding day excitement. But the moment she heard my breathing, her tone instantly shifted. Without waiting for me to explain, she asked where I was and what had happened. I did not break down again. Instead, my voice hardened into steel. I told her the wedding was off, but I could not just walk away. Because if I simply canceled the ceremony, Richard would destroy the evidence and find another vulnerable woman to prey upon. I told Eleanor to bring her laptop, a legal pad, and a massive pot of black coffee to my hotel room immediately. I told her we had a financial audit to run. Within the hour, the bridal suite had been transformed into a war room. My wedding dress hung, ignored, in the corner like a ghost, while Eleanor and I sat surrounded by glowing screens and scattered paperwork, using my military clearance protocols. I bypassed Richard's polished digital summaries and accessed the raw, unedited files of the trust portal. It did not take long to find the hidden Schedule C addendum. Staring at the screen, the evidence of his calculated malice was undeniable. I pulled the time-stamped P-logs, tracking his digital footprint over the last 8 months. I found unauthorized access to my personal banking from unrecognized devices, test wire transfers of small amounts, and an email draft hidden in a shared account, proving he had already purchased a one-way ticket to a non-extradition country for 3 months after the wedding. This was not a sudden crime of opportunity or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a methodical, predatory operation designed to strip me of everything I had ever worked for. As I printed the final piece of evidence, staring at the damning pages in my hand, the lingering heartbreak evaporated entirely, replaced by a terrifying, absolute resolve. Richard Caldwell had designed a brilliant legal trap, assuming I would walk right into it blindfolded by love. But he had fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. I was about to show him exactly how a soldier dismantles a threat. The glow of the laptop screen cast long, harsh shadows across the walls of the bridal suite as Eleanor and I delved deeper into the digital labyrinth of Richard Caldwell's life. The initial shock of his betrayal had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, hyper-focused determination. If Richard was methodical enough to bury a power of attorney clause inside a 40-page trust document, I knew this could not possibly be his first time executing this kind of financial ambush. I asked Eleanor to pull the public divorce records from the surrounding counties over the last 15 years. It took nearly 2 hours of cross-referencing property deeds and court filings before a chilling pattern emerged from the screen. 10 years ago, Richard had been married to a woman named Diane Hughes, a successful neurosurgeon who, much like me, had brought significant independent wealth into the marriage. According to the scattered digital footprint, Diane had purportedly lost her entire estate due to unfortunate offshore investments right before their surprisingly swift divorce. My military instinct screamed that this was not a coincidence. This was a blueprint. I managed to find a current phone number for Diane attached to a small medical consultancy firm in upstate New York. My hand was remarkably steady as I dialed the number. The quiet hum of the hotel air conditioner the only sound in the room. When Diane answered, her voice was clipped and professional. But the moment I introduced myself and mentioned Richard Caldwell, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the line. I explained, with absolute transparency, what I had discovered in the tailor shop that morning and the trap I was currently sitting inside. When Diane finally spoke, her voice trembled with the weight of an old, unhealed trauma. She told me how Richard had presented himself as her ultimate protector, convincing her to consolidate her assets into a joint management trust just days before their wedding. By the time she realized he was slowly siphoning her life's work into shell companies, she was legally paralyzed. She had spent 5 years in court trying to reclaim a fraction of her own money, only to walk away financially decimated and emotionally broken. Diane wept quietly as she thanked me for calling, confessing that for a decade, she had carried the deep, paralyzing shame of feeling foolish. I promised her, with a fierce conviction that echoed through the quiet hotel room, that Richard would not claim another victim. The psychological warfare truly began that evening at our rehearsal dinner. Walking into the crowded banquet room of the local country club, I felt like an undercover operative stepping into hostile territory. The room was filled with my fellow officers, Eleanor and Richard's polished law firm colleagues. Richard was holding court near the bar, looking incredibly handsome in a tailored charcoal suit, pouring wine and flashing that brilliant, practiced smile that had completely disarmed me 2 years ago. I forced myself to walk toward him, to accept his kiss on my cheek, and to smile back. But Richard was deeply observant. Throughout the dinner, I caught him studying me, sensing a microscopic shift in my demeanor. The absolute adoration he was used to seeing in my eyes had been replaced by a carefully constructed wall. He cornered me in the quiet hallway outside the restrooms, his tone dripping with manufactured concern. He placed a warm hand on my shoulder, claiming he felt a distance between us and suggesting that my wedding jitters were getting the best of me. Then the trap snapped perfectly into view. He casually pulled a sleek leather folder from his briefcase, suggesting that we just sign the final marriage license and the trust documents right there in the hallway to get the stressful paperwork out of the way. He framed it as a romantic gesture, a way to prove my absolute commitment to our future. I looked at the pen in his hand, feeling a wave of absolute disgust. I gave him a soft, apologetic smile, told him that my hands were shaking too much from the champagne, and promised I would sign everything in the morning before I walked down the aisle. He hesitated, a flash of irritation crossing his eyes, before the mask slid perfectly back into place. Late that night, long after Richard had left the hotel, I picked up my phone and made 2 highly classified calls. The first was to Major Hayes, a fiercely intelligent JAG attorney I had served with in Germany. The second was to Agent Miller, a federal financial crimes investigator who owed me a favor. The operation was officially in motion. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and impossibly clear, the North Carolina sunlight streaming beautifully through the towering stained glass windows of the Fort Liberty Chapel. Outside, the honor guard was already assembling, their pristine white gloves and polished rifles gleaming in the sun. Inside the chapel, 200 guests were taking their seats, murmuring with joyous anticipation while a string quartet played softly in the background. But I was not standing in the vestibule, holding a bouquet of white roses. I was in the private bridal suite located at the far end of the administrative corridor, fastening the heavy brass buttons of my Army service uniform. I had chosen not to wear a white gown. The dress blues felt like armor, the rows of ribbons on my chest a physical reminder of the discipline, sacrifice, and absolute resilience that defined my life. Eleanor stood quietly by the door, her arms crossed, watching me with a mixture of intense pride and nervous energy. Seated at the long mahogany table in the center of the room were Major Hayes, looking incredibly sharp in his own uniform, and Agent Miller, who wore a nondescript gray suit and a completely unreadable expression. We did not have to wait long. At exactly 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, there was a soft, confident knock at the door. Richard stepped into the room, a warm, charismatic smile plastered across his face, clearly expecting a private, romantic moment to secure those final signatures. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, his smile faltered. He looked at Eleanor, then at the 2 strange kinsmen sitting rigidly at the table, and finally at me, standing tall and utterly unbothered by the window. Confusion bled rapidly into panic as he took a tentative step backward. He asked what was going on, his voice losing its deep, resonant confidence. I did not raise my voice. The power in the room was absolute and entirely mine. I walked slowly over to the mahogany table and pushed a thick manila folder across the polished wood toward him. I calmly informed him that the folder contained a formal, legally binding revocation of his carefully drafted trust, an immediate freeze on the offshore LLC he had registered in the Cayman Islands, and a preliminary draft of a federal indictment for wire fraud and attempted extortion. Richard's face lost all its color, turning a sickly shade of gray, His eyes darted frantically around the room, assessing the threat level of the men sitting at the table. He desperately tried to rely on the charm that had saved him 1,000 times before. He took a step toward me, reaching out a trembling hand, his voice dropping into a pleading, theatrical whisper. He claimed I was misunderstanding the complex legalese, swearing that he had only designed the structures to protect our family's wealth from the government. He begged me not to let my paranoia destroy the beautiful life we had built. I pulled my hand back sharply, refusing to let him touch me. I looked directly into the eyes of the man I had almost surrendered my entire life to, feeling nothing but a cold, clinical pity. I told him that he had relied entirely on the arrogant assumption that love makes an older woman blind, desperate, and remarkably compliant. I reminded him that he had forgotten one crucial detail. I was a combat logistics officer. When I realize I am walking into a heavily booby-trapped minefield, I do not close my eyes and hope for the best. I systematically dismantle the threat. I did not let him speak another word. Nor did I stay to watch Agent Miller read Richard his preliminary rights. I turned on my heel, the polished leather of my shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and walked out of the bridal suite. I left him to the devastating consequences of his own hubris. As I stepped out onto the sunlit patio behind the chapel, I found the people who truly mattered waiting for me in the quiet morning air. Eleanor rushed forward to squeeze my hand, and standing just a few feet away, holding his worn cap in his hands, was William Vance. The old sergeant gave me a single, respectful nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of a mission flawlessly executed. I took a deep breath of the fresh, clean air, realizing that I had not lost a marriage today. I had successfully defended my future, reclaimed my absolute independence, and stepped entirely back into my own power. The immediate relief of stepping onto the sunlit patio was intoxicating, a sudden rush of pure, unadulterated oxygen filling my lungs after months of breathing in a carefully manufactured illusion. But as I stood there with Eleanor and Sergeant William Vance, listening to the faint, elegant strains of the string quartet drifting through the heavy oak doors, I knew the mission was not entirely complete. There were still 200 guests sitting inside that chapel, my commanding officers, my closest friends, and Richard's sprawling network of colleagues and family members. They were waiting for a bride in white. They were waiting for a celebration of a love story that had never truly existed. Eleanor offered to go inside and make a brief announcement on my behalf, to spare me the public scrutiny, but I gently shook my head. I had not spent a quarter of a century leading soldiers through chaotic deployments, only to hide behind my little sister when my own life required leadership. I smoothed the lapels of my Army service uniform, took a deep, steadying breath that anchored me firmly to the ground, and walked back into the chapel to face the crowd. As I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped into the center aisle, the string quartet faltered, their bows hovering uncertainly over their instruments. The sudden silence in the sanctuary was absolute, thick with confusion and a rapidly spreading tension. Every head turned toward me. They saw the crisp blue uniform, the gleaming brass, and the rows of ribbons instead of a veil and lace. I walked with deliberate, measured steps down the aisle, my head held high, looking directly into the faces of the people I cared about. I bypassed the altar entirely and turned to face the congregation. In the front row, my commanding general sat up slightly straighter, sensing the undeniable shift in the atmosphere. I did not use a microphone. I simply let my voice project with the same calm, resonant authority I used during high-stakes strategic briefings. I thanked them all for traveling to be there, acknowledging the love and support that filled the room. Then, without a tremor in my voice, I announced that there would be no wedding ceremony today, nor would there be one in the future. A collective, stunned murmur rippled through the pews. I raised my hand slightly, and the room instantly quieted. I did not scream, I did not cry, and I did not launch into a dramatic, vindictive tirade about offshore accounts and wire fraud. True power lies in restraint. I simply stated that the foundation of any enduring partnership must be absolute, uncompromising trust. And it had come to my attention that the man I was supposed to marry had severely and deliberately breached that trust. I told them that as a soldier. I was trained to recognize when a situation had become irreparably compromised, and as a woman, I valued my own peace and dignity far too much to proceed with a lie. While I was speaking, the side door of the chapel quietly opened. Major Hayes and Agent Miller escorted Richard out of the building. He looked utterly diminished, his tailored suit suddenly appearing 2 sizes too big, his face completely devoid of its usual arrogant charm. He did not look at me, and I did not watch him leave. Once the door clicked shut, I looked back at my guests and informed them that while the marriage was canceled, the reception venue was fully paid for. I invited my friends and family to join me at the country club, not to mourn a broken engagement, but to celebrate the immense, beautiful privilege of dodging a devastating bullet. The first person to stand up was my commanding general, who gave me a crisp, slow salute before leading the way out. It was not a walk of shame, it was a victory march. 6 months have passed since that morning at the Fort Liberty Chapel. I retired from the military shortly after, trading my dress uniform for denim and heavy boots, and moved permanently to the Virginia estate my parents left me. The house is quiet now, but it is a profoundly peaceful quiet. The sprawling acres of ancient oak trees and rolling green pastures remain safely in my name, a legacy preserved because I refuse to let societal pressure override my own intuition. Just last week, I drove back to North Carolina to visit Dawson's Military Tailoring. I brought William Vance a bottle of incredibly expensive bourbon and a handwritten letter that simply said, "Thank you for guarding the perimeter." We sat in the back of his shop, drinking terrible black coffee, and for the first time since that terrible Tuesday, we laughed. It was a deep, healing laughter that reminded me that the world is still full of fundamentally good, fiercely honorable people who will step out of the shadows to protect you when you need it most. But I did not turn on this camera today just to tell you a dramatic story about a canceled wedding. I am sitting here, speaking directly to you, because I know there is a woman watching this who feels a cold knot of dread is in her stomach when she looks at her own bank accounts, her own contracts, or her own partner. For a long time, I felt deeply humiliated. I asked myself how a woman of my age, with my extensive career and education, could be so easily fooled by a well-dressed man with a charming smile. But I realized something profound during these last 6 months of healing, and I need every woman listening to this to hear me clearly. Being trusting is not a character flaw. It is a sign of a beautiful, healthy, and open heart. The shame does not belong to the woman who loved openly. The absolute shame belongs entirely to the predator who weaponized that love for his own financial gain. We are constantly taught by society that as women age, our value somehow decreases, and that we should simply be grateful for a successful man who pays us attention. That toxic conditioning is exactly what men like Richard Caldwell bank on. They want you to feel so desperate for companionship, so afraid of growing old alone, that you will blindly hand over the keys to your hard-earned kingdom. Never apologize for asking the hard questions. Never feel guilty for demanding to read every single page of a contract. And never let anyone convince you that protecting your assets is unromantic. True love does not rush you. True love does not operate in the shadows of legal fine print. And equality in a relationship means your peace of mind and your future are fiercely protected, not quietly absorbed. Walking away from an altar, or a home, or a relationship does not mean your life has failed. It means your intuition has spectacularly succeeded. I am 48 years old, and my life is not over. It has just been gloriously reclaimed. If my story resonated with you, if you have ever had to summon the terrifying courage to walk away from a beautifully packaged lie, I want you to share your story in the comments below. Let this space be a sanctuary for us. Please hit the subscribe button, not just to support this channel, but to officially join a community of women who are choosing their own peace over a toxic illusion. My final warning to you is this: protect your peace, protect your assets, And never silence your inner voice just to keep a man comfortable. You are worth far more than a signature on a page. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next story. The wheels of justice turn with an agonizing, bureaucratic slowness, a grinding pace that stands in stark contrast to the swift, devastating emotional impact of betrayal. It was 14 months after I had walked out of that bridal suite before I found myself walking up the wide marble steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Raleigh. The North Carolina air was biting and cold that morning, a sharp physical reminder that the seasons had changed. And so had I. I was no longer the stunned, heartbroken woman hiding in the back of a dusty tailoring shop. I was a retired military commander, a federal witness, and a woman who had meticulously reclaimed every square inch of her own sovereignty. Walking through the heavy metal doors and passing through the security checkpoint, I felt a familiar, steadying calm wash over me. I had spent my entire military career operating within highly structured, heavily regulated environments. The courtroom was just another theater of operations, governed by strict rules of engagement. And this time, the enemy was completely outmaneuvered. I was accompanied by my sister Eleanor, who held my arm with a fierce, grounding loyalty, and Agent Miller, who had spent the last year meticulously dismantling the sprawling web of offshore accounts and shell companies that Richard Caldwell had spent a decade building. Stepping into the courtroom, the very first thing I noticed was the profound shift in the atmosphere. The space was sterile, clad in dark wood and echoing with the quiet rustle of legal documents. When Richard was finally led into the room by a federal marshal, the visual contrast was jarring enough to make me pause. The impeccably tailored, charismatic estate attorney who had effortlessly charmed my commanding officers at our rehearsal dinner was entirely gone. In his place sat a remarkably ordinary, visibly aged man wearing a standard issue, ill-fitting suit. His posture was slumped, his arrogant smirk replaced by a tight nervous grimace. He did not possess the towering, terrifying power he had once projected. Stripped of his expensive legal letterhead, his luxury cars, and the carefully cultivated illusion of wealth, he looked incredibly small. I took my seat in the gallery, watching with a clinical detachment as the federal prosecutor began laying out the incredibly complex architecture of his fraud. The prosecution did not just focus on my case. They pulled back the curtain on a deeply ingrained pattern of predatory behavior that spanned across state lines and multiple victims. The most powerful moment of the entire trial did not belong to me, nor did it belong to the brilliant federal prosecutors. It belonged to Diane, Richard's first wife. Watching her take the witness stand was an exercise in absolute awe. When I had first spoken to her on the phone a year earlier, her voice had been fragile, weighed down by a decade of unresolved shame and financial devastation. But sitting in that witness box, under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the federal courtroom, Diane was a force of nature. She recounted, with a chilling, unwavering clarity, exactly how Richard had manipulated her desire for a secure partnership into a legal labyrinth that eventually stripped her of her neurosurgery practice's assets. She methodically explained the specific clauses he had hidden in their joint management trust, looking directly at the jury without a single tear. When Richard's defense attorney attempted to aggressively cross-examine her, trying to paint her as a bitter, financially irresponsible ex-wife, Diane simply leaned forward and cited the exact dates, account numbers, and IP addresses that Agent Miller had uncovered. She weaponized the truth with a precision that left the defense entirely speechless. When it was finally my turn to testify, I felt no fear. I swore the oath, sat down, and looked directly at Richard for the first time in over a year. He refused to meet my gaze, staring fixedly at the legal pad in front of him. I did not speak about a broken heart. I did not offer the jury a melodramatic tale of a ruined wedding or shattered dreams. I spoke exclusively about logistics, unauthorized digital access, and the calculated weaponization of legal trust. I walked the jury through the exact timeline of how Richard had attempted to quietly transfer the liquid assets of my Virginia estate into a Cayman Islands LLC. A maneuver designed to finalize the moment our marriage certificate was officially recorded. I explained how predators operating in the white-collar world do not use physical violence to control their victims. They use complexity, jargon, and manufactured urgency. By the time I stepped down from the stand, the illusion of Richard Caldwell as a respectable, well-meaning attorney had been thoroughly and irreversibly incinerated. 2 weeks later, the jury returned a guilty verdict on multiple counts of wire fraud, attempted extortion, and financial exploitation. As the judge handed down a sentence that would ensure Richard spent the next 15 years in a federal penitentiary, I felt a profound sense of closure. The system had worked. But more importantly, my own internal alarm system had worked. I walked out of that courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, finally ready to turn my attention away from the man who had tried to destroy me, and toward the women I was determined to help save. The overwhelming response to the initial video I posted completely altered the trajectory of my retirement. I had originally intended to spend my post-military years quietly restoring the old Virginia estate, reading heavy historical biographies on my porch, and enjoying the profound silence of a solitary life. But within 48 hours of sharing my story online, my inbox was flooded with thousands of messages from women across the globe. These were not simply messages of sympathy. They were desperate, quiet pleas for logistical guidance. I'd read stories from women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who were sitting in beautiful, affluent homes, completely paralyzed by the sudden realization that they had no legal access to their own savings. I heard from brilliant, highly educated professionals who had slowly, imperceptibly handed over their financial autonomy to charismatic partners, only to wake up decades later trapped in a web of economic abuse. The sheer volume of these stories illuminated a massive, silent epidemic. I realized that my training as a combat logistics officer was not meant to end when I handed in my uniform. It was meant to be repurposed. The battlefield had simply shifted from foreign supply routes to domestic financial survival. I partnered with a coalition of female financial advisors, civilian attorneys, and trauma counselors to establish a formal advocacy foundation, operating straight out of the converted library of my estate. We affectionately named the initiative the Vanguard Project. Our mission was not to provide marriage counseling or emotional therapy, but to offer highly tactical, actionable exit strategies for women entangled in financially toxic relationships. We treated domestic financial abuse exactly like a hostage negotiation, removing the paralyzing shame and replacing it with concrete action plans. I began hosting weekly virtual seminars, teaching women the absolute necessity of financial literacy. I taught them how to quietly run their own credit reports to check for hidden debts, how to locate and decipher the complex addendums in joint trust agreements, and how to safely secure their personal digital footprints before confronting a manipulative partner. I applied the exact same rigorous, emotionless planning to their escapes that I had once used to move armored convoys across hostile borders. One particular case stands out as the defining moment of this new chapter. A woman named Susan, a 55-year-old high school teacher from Ohio, contacted our foundation. She had been married for 20 years to a man who controlled every single cent of her salary, utilizing aggressive psychological gaslighting to convince her that she was incapable of managing money. She was terrified, isolated, and completely convinced that if she tried to leave, she would end up destitute on the street over the course of 3 months. Our team worked with Susan in absolute secrecy. We helped her open an independent, secure bank account using a safe address. We walked her through the process of freezing her credit to prevent her husband from opening retaliatory loans in her name, and we connected her with a fierce, local pro bono attorney who specialized in covert asset recovery. When Susan finally walked out of her front door, she did not leave with just the clothes on her back. She left with a legally protected financial foundation, a meticulously organized binder of evidence, and an unbreakable support system standing right behind her. receiving a photograph of Susan a year later, smiling brightly on the porch of an apartment she had rented entirely with her own money, was a victory far sweeter than any military commendation I had ever received. This journey has taught me that the most radical, powerful act a woman can engage in is the unapologetic protection of her own independence. We are conditioned by society to view financial boundaries in romantic relationships as cold, cynical, or unloving. We are told that true love requires blind, unconditional surrender. That is a dangerous, beautifully packaged lie. Unconditional love should apply to the way we care for a partner's heart, but it should never apply to the management of our life savings, our inherited estates, or our fundamental autonomy. True partnerships thrive in the light of absolute transparency, not in the shadows of hidden clauses and unequal power dynamics. If you are watching this, and you feel that familiar, quiet alarm bells ringing in the back of your mind, I am asking you to honor your own intelligence. Do the audit. Ask the uncomfortable questions. Demand to see the paperwork. You have an absolute, non-negotiable right to understand exactly where your money is going and how your future is being structured. The courage it takes to confront a painful truth is immense, but the absolute freedom that waits on the other side of that truth is entirely worth the battle. You are stronger than the lies you have been told, and you are far more capable than you realize. Welcome to the Vanguard. We have your back. As the second year of the Vanguard project began, the quiet sanctuary of my Virginia estate had fundamentally transformed into a bustling, highly sophisticated command center. The mahogany-lined library, once a place of solitary reflection, now hummed with the constant energy of ringing encrypted phones, the clatter of keyboards, and the quiet, intense conversations of our growing team. We had recruited forensic accountants, retired intelligence officers, and fiercely dedicated family law attorneys who were exhausted by a broken legal system. The sheer scale of the financial abuse epidemic was staggering, but what disturbed me the most was the rapid evolution of the weaponry. Predators were no longer just hiding assets in traditional offshore bank accounts or forging signatures on physical trust documents, as Richard Caldwell had done. They had moved into the digital frontier. They were utilizing cryptocurrency wallets, automated algorithmic trading accounts, and impenetrable webs of decentralized finance to completely erase their victims' economic footprints. I realized that if our foundation was going to survive and effectively protect these women, we had to adapt our logistics to navigate a battlefield made entirely of code and digital shadows. This brutal reality became undeniably clear when a woman named Elena was discreetly referred to our organization. Elena was married to a prominent Silicon Valley technology executive, a man who possessed unlimited financial resources and a terrifying mastery of digital surveillance. When she first contacted us through a burner phone purchased with cash, her voice was barely above a whisper, laced with a level of sheer panic that made my blood run cold. Her husband had not just restricted her access to their bank accounts. He had digitally imprisoned her. He monitored every keystroke on her devices, tracked her physical location through the GPS in her car, and had quietly transitioned all of their liquid assets into untraceable offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. He had convinced her that if she ever tried to leave, she would walk away with absolutely nothing. And because of his high-profile connections, no traditional lawyer would ever dare to take her case. Elena was sitting inside a multi-million-dollar glass mansion in California, starving for basic autonomy, utterly paralyzed by a man who used technology as a silent, invisible chain. Listening to Elena's story, I felt a familiar, icy resolve settle into my chest, identical to the hyper-focused calm I used to experience right before authorizing a high-risk extraction mission in a combat zone. I immediately assembled our newly formed Cyber Intelligence Division. This was no longer a simple matter of uncovering hidden legal clauses. This was a digital hostage rescue. We operated with absolute operational security. We smuggled a clean, unmonitored laptop to Elena through a trusted grocery delivery driver, allowing her to communicate with us without triggering her husband's surveillance network. for 6 grueling weeks. Our forensic analysts meticulously traced the blockchain ledgers, utilizing advanced decryption software to map the sprawling, hidden empire her husband had built using their joint marital funds. It was a logistical nightmare, a labyrinth of shell companies and digital tokens. But my military training had taught me that no fortress is truly impenetrable if you have the patience to find the structural flaw in the wall. The breakthrough finally came when our analysts discovered a critical, arrogant mistake in the executive's digital architecture. In his absolute confidence that his wife would never be smart enough to challenge him, he had linked one of the primary offshore crypto wallets to an email server associated with a heavily regulated federal contractor. It was the fatal error we needed. I immediately contacted Agent Miller, the same federal investigator who had brought down Richard Caldwell, and handed him a meticulously organized dossier of evidence that proved blatant financial fraud, tax evasion, and illegal wire transfers. We did not just prepare a divorce filing for Elena. We prepared a federal indictment for her abuser. When the tactical extraction day finally arrived, we did not send Elena out the front door with a suitcase. We waited until her husband was detained by federal agents at his corporate headquarters. And then a private security team hired by our foundation escorted safely to a waiting jet. She left that glass prison with a court-ordered freeze on all of his digital assets, completely reclaiming her financial power. Watching the news coverage of his high-profile arrest later that evening, I realized that Vanguard had officially shifted from playing defense to going strictly on the offensive. The successful extraction of Elena and the subsequent public downfall of her tech executive husband catapulted the Vanguard project onto the national stage. Almost overnight, we evolved from a grassroots support foundation, operating out of a Virginia library, into a formidable, nationally recognized institution for financial justice. We were essentially receiving requests from federal lawmakers, seeking our consultation to draft comprehensive legislation that would legally classify economic coercion as a severe form of domestic abuse. I found myself trading my comfortable retirement denim for tailored suits once again, traveling to Washington, D.C., to testify before congressional committees. Standing at those heavy wooden podiums, looking at the rows of politicians, I did not speak with the fiery rhetoric of a politician. I spoke with the cold, undeniable precision of a logistics officer. I presented them with the hard data, the tragic case studies, and the terrifying reality that thousands of women were being systematically starved of their fundamental human rights right inside their own homes. The legislation we championed eventually passed, creating strict new federal penalties for the concealment of marital assets and providing victims with immediate, emergency access to frozen funds. Despite the incredible, sweeping national victories, the moments that brought me the most profound peace were always the quiet ones. One crisp autumn afternoon, a large, heavy package arrived at the Virginia estate with no return address. When I carefully opened the cardboard box, I found a beautifully preserved, antique brass compass, the kind used by early naval navigators to find their way through treacherous, uncharted waters. Resting beneath the compass was a handwritten note on thick parchment paper. It was from William Vance, the retired Army sergeant who had shoved me into that fitting room in his tailored filling shop nearly 3 years ago, effectively saving my life. The note was incredibly brief, bearing the distinct, no-nonsense tone of an old soldier. It simply read, "Colonel, I always knew you were meant to lead people out of the dark. Keep pointing them north." I sat in library for a very long time, holding that heavy brass compass in the palm of my hand, feeling an overwhelming wave of gratitude wash over me. The agonizing betrayal I had suffered at the hands of Richard Caldwell had not destroyed me. It had merely been the catalyst required to redirect my life toward its ultimate, truest purpose. As I stand on the sprawling wooden porch of my estate today, watching the sun dip below the rolling Virginia hills, I realize that the deepest form of healing does not come from forgetting the trauma, but from aggressively repurposing it. I am no longer defined by the wedding that never happened, nor am I defined by the sheer cruelty of a man who tried to reduce my life's work to a mere signature on a fraudulent contract. I am defined by the fortress of independence I have built, both for myself and for the thousands of women who have walked through the doors of the Vanguard Project. We have fundamentally changed the narrative of what it means to be a woman who has been deceived. We have proven that being targeted by predators is not a mark of shame or a testament to our naivety. It is a testament to the immense, valuable light we carry, a light that others desperately wish to steal. I want to leave you with this final, unwavering truth. If you are currently sitting in the dark, staring at a partner who speaks to you in a language of confusion, control, and financial dominance, please know that you are not trapped. The walls around you might look like impenetrable concrete, but they are built entirely on illusions and legal sleight of hand. You possess an innate, terrifying strength that has simply been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Do not be afraid to shatter the illusion of a perfect life in order to build a real one. Embrace the absolute power of your own intellect. Demand total transparency. And never let anyone convince you that your need for security is an inconvenience. The road to reclaiming your sovereignty is steep, terrifying, and deeply exhausting. But I promise you, the air at the top of that mountain is incredibly sweet. Keep your eyes open, trust your own brilliant mind, and never surrender the command of your own life. Before we close this chapter, I want to speak directly to your heart for a moment. The story of Margaret and Richard is not just an entertaining drama, it is a mirror reflecting a silent, pervasive reality that countless women face every single day. As we age, society subtly conditions us to believe that our value is decreasing. We are told to be grateful when a charming, successful partner enters our lives. And in our beautiful, natural desire for companionship, we are often pressured to lower our defenses. But let this story be the ultimate reminder. Your desire for love should never require the surrender of your security. Being a trusting, loving woman is a profound strength, not a character flaw. The shame of betrayal never belongs to the woman who loved openly. It belongs entirely to the coward who saw that love as an opportunity for theft. Financial abuse is a quiet predator. It does not announce itself with raised voices or physical threats. It hides behind sweet words, complex legal jargon, and the manufactured urgency of signing a contract to prove your commitment. True love, absolute genuine partnership, thrives in the light of absolute transparency. It encourages questions. It demands equality. It protects your peace of mind and your assets just as fiercely as it protects your heart. If you are currently sitting in a beautiful home, feeling a quiet, heavy knot of dread about your financial autonomy, listen to that inner voice. Do not be afraid to shatter the illusion of a perfect relationship to save yourself. You possess a terrifying, brilliant strength. Ask the hard questions. Demand to read the fine print. And never silence your intuition just to keep a man comfortable. Walking away from an altar, a relationship, or a shared life does not mean you have failed. It means you have the courage to reclaim your sovereignty. You are worth far more than a signature on a page. Stay vigilant, protect your peace, and always trust your instincts. This content was meticulously researched, manually structured, and carefully edited by our team to bring you meaningful insights and valuable life lessons.